morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Abhinav Agarwal. I am the curator of Indic Book Club, and I am delighted to start today the first of our Indic Book Club author Q&A series. And while IBC had done these author interviews a few years back, now with the launch of our new Facebook group, which is Indic Book Club, we wanted to start or restart the series in its new form and avatar. And I am equally delighted to have as our very first author, Nitin Sridhar, who has very graciously accepted and agreed to come on to this author Q&A webinar. And while we will be talking about a lot of things, primarily I will be asking him questions and discussing his book, The Sabrimala Confusion: Menstruation Across Cultures, a Historical Perspective. This book has been published by Vitasta Publishers, and it's got a lot of good feedback and reviews from a lot of people, and I will just read out on the cover what Amish Tripathi has to say about the book. He says, in many of the Shakta and Shaivite traditions, women and their cycles are respected as fundamental to creation. Nitin has approached this delicate subject with maturity and nuance. And at the back of the book, Nitin, you have this quote from Sumedha Verma Ojha, who in her own right is a very well-known author, speaker, and columnist. And she says that menstruation is one of the most natural of processes in this mortal world, and yet hedged in by so many obfuscations, in common understanding, it is all about taboos and restrictions leading to unhealthy results. This book by Nitin Sridhar is a timely attempt to set the record straight. And then there was this review by Sri Bibek Debroy, who had a lot of nice things to say about this book. And it also came in at a very opportune time. So before that, I want to say a quick few words about Nitin. So Nitin is till a short while back, you used to be the editor of India Facts, and now you have taken up a new role at the Advait Academy. And you have written extensively on spirituality, religion, culture, politics, ecology, and social issues. And the interesting thing is that though you trained as a civil engineer, about 5 years back also, you moved to this sphere almost, I think, completely now, full-time. And you are based out of Mysore, which is the cultural capital of Karnataka. And you have also written a few other books, and we will talk about that. One of them is Musings on Hinduism. Another one is Samanya Dharma. And you also have another book coming out. So we will also talk about that, but more towards the end of this webinar. So thank you, Nitin, and welcome.
Thank you, Abhinav. I'm very glad to be here. Very happy to be here.
So, okay, I'll admit one thing. There are a lot of questions I want to ask you, and I'm not really sure what's the best way to begin. But let's start with the title. In your title, you have the Sabrimala Confusion, and this book did appear at a time when Sabrimala has been in the news for a lot of different reasons. So can you tell us, before we get into the rest of the book, can you tell us a little bit about, people have been reading, and a lot of people's opinions and views on this controversy would have been formed by what they have read in mainstream media, which has, for its own reasons, framed it as in one particular way. But can you tell us a little bit about what this controversy is, and where does it stand today?
Okay, so basically, the superscript of the title says the Shabarimala confusion. And what is this confusion? People ask me, and I want to like to highlight this. The confusion is that the mainstream narrative, it may be in media, it may be intellectuals, social media, wherever it is, the Shabarimala issue has been deliberately portrayed as an issue that is related to menstruation of women. That is somehow the narrative. One is the aspect of the temple itself, that how the non-allowance of women of certain age in the temple is results in a kind of gender inequality and discrimination against women. But the other underlying narrative is that This happens because Hinduism, Hindu philosophy, Hindu tradition in general looks down upon menstruation as something dirty, as something regressive, something bad and evil. So this regressive and kind of offensive view of Hindu philosophy towards menstruation is also causing them to prevent women from going to Shabarimala. So this is the confusion that is created. The fact is there is no direct connection per se between the practices, the stipulations of the temple, and the views of menstruation in Hinduism. At best, there is a indirect connection. The fact is, the Shabrimala temple practice is basically related to the nature of the deity that is present in there, which is a special form of Ayyappa Swami, Dharmasashta, special form in the sense, in the form of Naishtika Brahmachari. And because of Brahmacharya rules, the basically certain prescriptions are given there. And the temple forms part of the different Sashta temples, and there are certain other detailed issues, the spiritual aspects and all. But the
So
primary criteria,
let me
yeah.
interrupt you right there. Sorry. So are you saying that this restriction on the entry of women of a particular age at this particular temple is not universal or widespread? So let's just get this clear. Are you saying that women, there is no restriction of entry of women into Ayyappa temples otherwise?
Yes, exactly. The restriction is only in that particular temple in Shabarimala. There are other temples within Kerala which are equally important, equally considered divinely important kshetram of Ayyappa Swami, the Dharmasashtra. But there, this restriction is not there. There are temples where the Sashta is in a child form, in a married form, in many other forms. See, ultimately, whatever be the form, the essence is the same that of Sashta. So a devotee of Ayyappa Swami, a women devotee, can easily visit any of the other temples.
Okay, so
Yeah.
another thing is a question that I have is that is the temple open to people of all faiths? So if one is not a Hindu, can that person uh, do a pilgrimage of Sabrimala?
I think a lot of people from other faith do it. I am not very sure of this aspect, but in
Okay.
general, you can see that
But
there
the
is
but the stipulations are common for everyone.
yes, if they are taking this Shabrimala, doing this pilgrimage as part of the vrata, not everybody takes the vrata, right? But those who take the vrata, the stipulations are same. There is a diksha part, there is a strict observation part for 41 days or so, and then finally the pilgrimage happens. So the ritualistic part is same for everybody. Anybody who wants to do that vrata has to follow that stipulation irrespective of any other
Okay.
things.
And is this restriction a new one, or has it been in place for a long time?
See, there are some people who argue that this restriction on women of certain age is a new thing, but that is not so. Because this restriction arise from the very words of Ayyappa Swami as noted in Bhutanatha Upakyana and other texts, wherein he mentions about his brahmacharya nature and all those things. So legally speaking, of course, India itself as a modern nation state is just a few decades old, and with it the legal things that we have today has come up, but as a traditional practice, this goes for a long time.
Okay. Okay. So now let's step back and I want to know. So the elephant in the room, so to say, is what led you, a male, a man, to get so interested in the subject to the point of doing so much of research in it and then coming out with a book? I'm sure others will also have this question, and so do I'm curious.
I think the very simple answer is curiosity coupled with lack of answers. I think much of the things that I have done in my life has to do with these two things. When, as I was saying, that back in 2015, when Sabrimala issue was again in the news and all this narrative was happening, I said there was underlying media narrative regarding menstruation and how Hinduism considers women as impure and dirty and all those things. So I was just, a lot of people wrote about the temple itself and how the narrative of equality, etc., regarding the temple is misleading. But I did not see anybody, at least to my knowledge, not a single person actually countered the underlying narrative about Hinduism per se degrading women, degrading menstruating women by considering menstruation as a dirty process or something like that. So my beginning interest in this topic was a completely as a someone who is interested in truth. I had no sides to take. In fact, I would say that some 10 years back, I did not subscribe to this notion of purity and impurity at all, per se. And I kind of took the extreme view, which is valid in particular context, like in a context of a certain sampradayas, wherein there is no purity or impurity. Everything is you tend to transcend this duality. But anyways, so from I had this, I did not believe in the notion of impurity per se. So I was agnostic to this notions, and I just wanted to know what is the truth. What does the Hindu Shastras, Hindu texts, Hindu practices speak about this? And when I searched in the internet, when I searched in the books and all, at beginning I did not find mm, um, any proper treatment of the issue, any in-depth treatment of the issue. I did found one or two papers by Western scholars, and as is usually the case, I mean, they mix facts with a lot of prejudice. So even if there is even sometimes even fiction, but even if we think that no serious scholars do not do fiction, but even then there is always a prejudice and bias. So since I have been in this field for some time and I have been reading a lot of stuff, so I felt that, more and more I researched from primary sources like the Yajurveda Samhita, the Manusmriti and the other Dharma Shastras and the Puranas, and even Ayurvedic texts. I realized that there is a lot of materials that people do not know, and these practices, the things we say, that do not go to temple or puja during menstruation, do not cook or take rest. All these practices have a very make sense. They are not illogical. They are not superstition. They are not products of some regressive society, but they have, most of these stipulations have a Ayurvedic basis, and they are given for the health, for catering to the health of the women, and those with the Dharma Shastric basis, they cater to the overall well-being of the women. So these are the things that when I discovered, I thought, look, after some research, I have understood this. So it's kind of my duty to share it with the world, and that is how I wrote this the series in India Packs in 2015, which now currently Indic Today is republishing, called Hindu Views of Menstruation. It was a 6-part series, and when I finished with the topic, I thought, okay, I'm done. I have my work is done. I have shared. My contribution is over. But then Renukal Verma, my publisher from Vitasta, she approached me. She said, "Look, can you make this into a book? Can you expand this into a book?" And then I was first hesitant. I thought I had already written what I want to write. What more can I write? But then I got an idea. Then why not make it a more comprehensive book, in the sense that not only focusing on Hindu Dharma, but let me investigate the notions in religions across the world, in ancient civilizations like Greek, Rome, etc., and do a comparative analysis and contrast this religious and the cultural views with the modernity, the kind of scientific or scientist modernity views that we have today. So I have this is the whole thing that I have done in the book. So comparing and contrasting the study and kind of summarizing each culture's basic foundational views and practices and trying to interpret them from a Indic perspective. I mean, see, a lot of the material you get on Greek, Rome, and other ancient civilizations, the scholars come from the Western scholars, and they come from a Christian bias and the Christian cultural framework and intellectual framework. So I have tried to, present their views honestly, but at the same time, try to shed a Indic perspective, a Hindu interpretation of certain polytheistic practices, because Hinduism is more close to ancient Greece than Christianity is to ancient Greece. So I have tried to do this as well in the book.
Okay, perfect. So you touched upon a lot of things and topics that I think will make for fascinating discussion now. You talked about impurity. You talked about the notion of of these restrictions. You talked about some Western biases. You talked about your research that you did and in terms of comparing practices across history in different religions. And you also talked about how the series of articles you wrote then ended up becoming a book. So let's start with the very first one. What do you mean by, or what do people mean, or what do beliefs, traditional cultures and beliefs or religions mean when they talk about purity, impurity? I mean, the fact is that every one of us carries some form of impurities inside of us. You know, bodily waste and other things. So why is it applied only to women? So I'm not clear about that, and I'm sure a lot of people have similar questions. Can you tell us why and what?
Okay, that's in fact the notion of impurity this is the elephant. This is the true elephant in the room, because uh, as I realized when I researched on the topic, that this is one point that is most misunderstood, misinterpreted, and it does not have a homogeneous meaning, and it is an English word which we should always keep in mind. See, when we think in English and when we write in English and say that, look, menstruation is considered as impurity, or menstruating women are considered as impure in Hinduism during their periods. So it conveys a very negative meaning, like something dirty, something sinful, something bad, or a kind of a moral judgment. But when I studied the Sanskrit texts, the Shastras, the Smritis, and the Veda and all, I realized that this moral judgment is completely missing. The Shastric word is the term is ashaucha. There is shaucha and there is ashaucha. Shaucha is what is translated as purity, and ashaucha as impurity. They have a element of ritual impurity, yes, but this is not a moral judgment. So what do they actually mean? To understand ashaucha, we need to understand shaucha, right? So let me just quickly give a little bit background, because otherwise the meaning will be lost. In our Indian perspective, individual is not just made up of a physical body, right? So Vedanta, for example, gives the perspective of panchakoshas. We have the physical sheet, the physical body, and we have the subtle body, which is made up of the pranamaya kosha, which is the level of pranas, the five pranas, which cause our breathing process, our assimilation process, and all this nerve circulatory things, all those things. And then we have the mind, manomaya kosha, and there are other two levels as well. But these three are most important to our case. So when we speak about purity and impurity, there are two aspects to it. One is the aspect of purity per se or cleanliness per se, but there is the other aspect which is of competence or incompetence. there are texts which clearly says that to perform any action, especially Vaidika or Agamika or any religious action, one has to be pure. One has to be in a condition of shaucha. So, for example, when we go to a temple, we wash our legs and enter the temple, right? And when we sit for a puja, we take a bath and only then sit for a puja. So these are all because of this. So what does this purity means? At the physical level, it will mean complete cleanliness. But at the level of the mind, it will mean a condition of calmness and purity of the thought and calmness, no distractions, that is, which are all caused due to sattva guna, right? When mind is resting in sattva guna, there is calmness, and that is called as purity. But when in the level of the prana, the pranamaya kosha, there are 5 pranas. These 5 pranas has to be in a balanced condition, and only then it is considered as shaucha. But what happens during menstruation? There is a flow of blood at the physical level, right? And at the level of the pranas, there is a imbalance in the pancha pranas. The apana vayu is in a heightened condition. The Ayurvedic text says this heightened condition is because to facilitate the process of menstruation, to facilitate women to the biological process of making her fertile, making her able to bear the children, right? So this is the whole process. So there is a rajas excess of rajasic energy at the level of the prana, and there is a excess of rajo guna at the level of the mind. That is why women during menstruation has these mood swings. Many of them find irritation and change in moods. All those things happen. So this is why in Sanskrit, in Ayurveda, and any other text, the term used for menstruation is Rajasvala or Rajashrava. Rajashrava means flow of Rajas. Rajas is blood in the physical body. Rajas is Rajoguna. Rajas is also Rajasic energy. So when we speak that, look, menstruation is ashaucha. It is ritual impure, for lack of better word in English. What it simply means is women are in a heightened condition of rajas, and due to this heightened condition of rajas, they become ineligible or incompetent to perform certain actions like puja, cooking, and physical exercises. That's it. And certain actions are not considered good for them. So that's it. So there is no moral judgment. There is no saying that women become somehow bad or evil or dirty. No. There no such meanings are associated. Second point, this notion of ashaucha is not unique to women, right? Any flow of blood has a kind of ashaucha. Even if a man has a injury in the body and there is a blood flow, even that is ashaucha. But the difference between that ashaucha and the kind of ashaucha in the menstruation is that in the menstruation involves removing of ama or the bodily toxins. It involves a heightened condition of rajas in the mind and the pranic level. Mere injury does not have that. And even there are ashaucha related to, for example, when there is a death in the house, the immediate family members are not allowed to perform the daily day-to-day religious duties, right? So that is ashaucha. There is incompetence there as well. And similarly, there is ashaucha regarding birth of the baby, right? So the point is, it is not just the women who have this the notion of purity or impurity is associated. Both men and women undergo these processes at different points in life. Women, because of their biology, because of their biology and their ability to the cycle of menstruation and motherhood, they undergo a particular kind of this ashaucha, wherein they become ineligible to certain actions. This is the basic meaning. So the second part of your question, then we have to think is, if ashaucha does not have a moral judgment, does not mean dirty or degraded person, then where did this negative meaning of impurity comes from, right? Interesting.
Correct. Because one thing that you clarified and answered, which I was going to ask is that does this not apply? So yes, and by way of clarification, I'll also say that there is one people can send in their questions using the Q&A. Once we are done with our discussion, we will take up those questions. So if you have any questions, people, you can post them to the Q&A section here. So yes, Nitin, do carry on. So yes, where did this notion of this negative connotation of impurity and all of that come from? And perhaps you can also talk about, or maybe leave this for a subsequent question is you cover this in a couple of chapters in your book on what was the view of Christianity and before that Judaism on these topics firstly, and you also talk about how from pre-Christianity, early Christianity, and then to medieval times, these views underwent a change. So let's start, wherever you feel comfortable, let's start with that.
Okay, yeah. See, so when I investigated this, from where do we get this meaning of impurity in a negative sense? Because see, in the West, even in Greco-Roman culture, the polytheistic Greek civilizations, we have a similar concept of shaucha in the sense of catharsis and miasma. And they have a similar meanings to our meaning in the sense of vitality and incompetence, right? The miasma means incompetence or loss of vitality and all. So the question is, from where then does the meaning of negative connotations come from? So when I read the texts of related to Christianity and the various works done by scholars, I realized that it is in the Abrahamic religious view, the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the negative meaning comes from. See, English is the language of Western culture, and Western culture is rooted in Abrahamic frameworks, right? So what happens in Christianity is they connect the notion of menstruation with the original sin of Eve. We all know the story of the original sin, right? In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve was there, and Eve ate the forbidden apple, and they were removed from there, and this led to the fall of humans, right? So, as a punishment to this, because it was Eve who led astray that Adam as well. The Christian text and scholars, they say that God punished women to menstruate every month, to partake in this sin, to as a punishment for this original sin. So the Christian theology believes that women are partake in this sin. They suffer the punishment for this sin every month. So therefore, they consider women to be entering a state of sinfulness during their 3 days periods. And this they call by the term impurity. The terminology they derived from the Greco-Romans, but the meaning they reformulated it, reinterpreted it to fit into their biblical, narrative. So while they continue to call this as impurity or miasma, the meaning had changed. Now it is related to, it is considered as a state of sinfulness. So a state of moral degradation.
So Nitin, let me interrupt you right there. So this concept of this original sin, is that found in the New Testament? Is this found in the Bible?
See, it is found in the Old Testament itself. The story of Adam and Eve, it is found in the Old Testament, right? So, and this Old Testament is subscribed by both the Jewish people as well as Christian people, right? But there is a difference in how they interpret it, and there is a lot of, it's a very lot of complex to go into the depth. But the basic point is it is this Abrahamic correlation between the menstruation process and the notion of sinfulness is something that is the reason why the term impurity with respect to menstruation is associated with all kind of negative connotations, all kind of moral connotations. This has nothing to do with Hinduism or any polytheistic traditions or anything. So come to the second question. You said that I should address about early Christianity and later Christianity, right?
Right, right.
So, yeah, shall I address that?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. So this has been one of the interesting part of my study. That this early Christianity, it's the Council of what was that? The early
Nicene,
Christianity refers to.
yeah, the Nicene
Yeah.
Conference of 325 AD, I think.
Yes, yes, exactly. So I have forgotten these specific details. So usually the before that council was constituted, the early ways that the Christianity evolved are considered as early Christianity, and there were different. It had the different forms in different places and all. In one particular sect or one particular evolvement of early Christianity, we have a very interesting notions of wherein it was posited that baptism is a one-time event. It purifies the new Christians, yeah, the new converts to Christianity. It purifies them of all kinds of impurities, and they no longer need to do any other purification processes. To understand this, we need to understand that when early Christianity arises, what does a new religion does? It tries to define itself by by kind of othering the mother religion. So it kind of wanted a unique identity. So it wanted to differentiate itself from the Jewish religion, right? So among the Jews, you have a very strong, very detailed notions of purity and impurity, and all these are mentioned in Torah and all those texts. The Old Testament, the Torah is the Hebrew version of Old Testament, right? So all these are very much there. In Jewish women observe a 7 day period, and I think sometimes it goes up to 12 days. So they have these details. I have the details in my book. They call it Nidha. Nidha is a period of during when the menstruation happens, the periods happen. It is considered a state of ritual impurity. So Nidha is defined as a state of ritual impurity in which women experiences. It starts when there is uterine bleeding. The not any kind of bleeding, but the bleeding with respect to menstruation. That when there is uterine bleeding and the woman becomes aware of it, then the period of Nidha starts. And once she has entered Nida, it will take her some time. I think for 7 days, she will be there in this condition. After the 7 days, when the bleeding stops, this is called as then comes the clean days. So there's a lot of details are there. At the end of the whole process, they have this ritualistic bath called mikveh, after which she is considered as being purified. So this is a practice in Judaism. So the early Christians, what they did at one particular, especially few particular sects of early Christians, what they said that no, see, baptism purifies you of everything. So after the new converts, they said told the new converts that now you should not observe Nida anymore. You should not observe Nida anymore because you have been purified by the Holy Spirit. So you should not consider yourself impure during your menstruation. And so you should do your prayers and everything. Because during Nida period, the Jews used to not do prayer and had a
Fascinating.
sexual abstinence from their husbands. So all those things there. But this idea did not gain currency even during early Christianity time itself, because other branches of early Christianity did not subscribe to that. The early thinkers and even after later, the later medieval Christianity, none of them have subscribed to that. On the other hand, the notion that there is impurity, ritual impurity, is very well entrenched within Christianity. Uh, Apart from this, some early trends that saying that baptism purifies them everywhere, right? So in medieval Christianity, of course, the practice has continued, but what happened was thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and others, they uh, kind of integrated Greco-Roman philosophical views into modern Christianity.
So Nitin,
Yeah.
let me interrupt you again there. So this fellow, this Thomas fellow, when you say medieval period, what centuries roughly are we talking about? 13th, 14th, 15th?
I think I need to do a very quick.
And the second question is.
Yeah.
Sure. And the second question is, so you have talked about, what Ayurveda had to say on this, what the Jewish practices were, what early Christianity was, but you brought in the topic of Greece and Greco attitudes, and so can you talk a little bit about that also before you come into what the medieval period saw, what change it saw in these attitudes?
Yeah. So what has happened? See, first of all, the Thomas Aquinas is in 13th century. Yes, as 1225 to 1274. I just did a quick Google search. So yeah, see, basically, the all polytheistic traditions share two aspects. They associate two aspects with menstruation. One is the notion of ritual impurity or miasma, or what is called as ashaucha in Hinduism, and the other aspect is sacredness. Both are associated, and often the scholars only focus on one thing and leaving out the sacredness aspect. For example, in Hinduism, we have deities like Kamakya, Parvati, etc., who are considered deities of menstruation. Similarly, in Greeks, we had Artemis. In Rome, we have Diana. Among the Mesopotamians, both versions of the Mesopotamian, Akkadians and the others, Sumerians, they had Inanna, and in the Egypt we had I think Sekhmet and few others, Isis and others. So the point is, their understanding of shaucha ashaucha, that is purity impurity, they called purity as catharsis and impurity as miasma, and they defined it in the sense of vitality and loss of vitality, competence and incompetence. So you will see some similar views like ours. Like for example, uh, we believe in practicing, a lot of women, traditional women especially, believe that women during menstruation should not touch tulsi and such plants, because that would result in kind of the plants will be affected by that. You can find similar beliefs in the works of Pliny and other uh, Greco-Roman scholars, right? They were basically noting down through observation and analysis the effect of miasma that happens, right? But the modern scholars and even I interpret in a way that somehow the Greeks were afraid of menstruation. But I am not sure this afraid is a correct term, at least in Greco-Roman thing. But it did attain the meaning of fear when it was reinterpreted and reformulated by Thomas Aquinas and other scholars, other Christian theologians in the medieval period. So they borrowed the Greco-Roman concepts, they reformulated to fit it into Christian theology. What more, the science was developing then, the medicine and other things. They refitted even these ideas into the Christian idea. So in the medieval Christianity, the fear of menstruation, or why the menstruation was considered as a sinfulness and evil, this this had a complicated influences. One is the original Christian biblical narrative about periods being a state of sinfulness. The second is the reformulated version of Greco-Roman philosophy and the medical fears of the initial scientific and medical developments that happened in the Europe. So at the end of the day, what happened, what resulted from all this negative views about menstruation was that people came to be afraid of menstruation. People came to be afraid of blood itself. So the blood itself was a big thing. They were afraid, and the menstruation was used to other the women. It was used to other the Jews, and there were a lot of derogatory literature. There were a lot of derogatory attitudes in people. This culminated basically in the genocide of women by calling them witches. You know, the witches, the witchcraft, because witchcraft was connected to blood magic, and women were considered to having bleeding every month by month through menstruation. So this negative notion of menstruation as evil, danger, and this got completely blown out of proportion and resulted in, by some accounts, the death and killing of around, I think, 9 million women in Europe accused of witchcraft. So,
Wow.
you see that it is a great error. It's not just error. It's not a blunder. It's a crime to equate the Christian narrative of the European narrative of impurity and their experience with the past and how it was misused and how it resulted in killing with a Hindu practice, Hindu designation as Ashaucha. We don't have this such kind of violence in the name of Ashaucha, in the name of anything in India. There is no correlation at all, and so it is unfortunately the common narrative is it routinely borrows the definition of impurity from the West and borrows the critique of impurity from the West and superimposes both among Hinduism. So after this, when the Reformation and then Enlightenment and all this modern thought arose in the West, they have severely critiqued these Christian notions of menstruation, Christian notions of impurity. So we are doing a cut and paste job of a Christian notion of impurity as well as the criticism of Christian notion of impurity and superimposing it on Indian traditions, of Hindu traditions. So this is a great crime, I would say. It is not just a blunder; it's a great crime. It's a great injustice to Hindu Dharma.
Very, 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 very interesting and fascinating because I'm sure, I didn't, and I'm sure a lot of people won't know the history behind all of, the history behind the discrimination against women that was practiced using these theological frameworks and constructs that you have just talked about, and you cover them in great detail in your book. And what I want to do now is move the discussion to now. So if you recall, after the Supreme Court judgment came out, there was there were a lot of protests by Hindu women, spontaneous, peaceful protests in Kerala, where literally hundreds of thousands of women, lakhs and lakhs of women came out on the streets and basically asking and demanding that their cultural beliefs, traditions, practices be respected. But unfortunately, that did not get much attention in either our mainstream media, and what is more, what was more surprising and even sad was that no one thought it fit to ask that why is it that the traditional beliefs of so many women are not being listened to. They are not considered important enough, and what even the petitioners, I think, had a change of heart but they were not allowed to withdraw their petition from the Supreme Court. So that in itself is a bizarre situation that we could have only in our glorious land. But leaving that aside, I think I am digressing here. My question is that, see, on the one hand, you have in the West now a recognition of women's choice, of women's empowerment, women's freedom. But strangely enough, when it comes to India, the notion of choice is circumscribed to mean choice only as interpreted by certain foreign imported constructs and not taking into account traditional beliefs and cultures. Now, I can understand if NGOs funded by foreign institutions take the stand because they're paid to do this. But what explains this illiteracy, cultural illiteracy among Hindus? I have my own thoughts on them, but they are neither here nor there. Since you have done a lot of work and research on the subject, do you have any thoughts that you can share with us?
See, I think the root cause of this is education and university system. I want to quote my friend Maragatam on this, who has done a research on this. He says the modern universities and education system is a new kind of religious institution, wherein one enters, while entering one is a Hindu, but once when one comes out, he has been converted into this religion of liberalism. So basically, what it means is our education system does not reflect our lived reality. It does not reflect our Indic thoughts, Indic ideas, Indic frameworks, Indic discourse. Forget it now. For the last 60 years, due to the colonialization, continued colonialism has so much become so much huge that we have forgotten what is Indic, what is our actual idea, our actual understanding of issue, and what is not ours. A very one simple example I will give you. Look at the laws related to abortion. Look at the movements related to abortion, or look at the kind of discourse related to abortion, or even take the example of issue of homosexuality. The kind of discourse, the kind of arguments. You can find influence of one or the other frameworks that has its origins in the West. The notion of equality, the notion of liberalism, the notion of all this framework, all these concepts, we have simply cut, copy, paste. That is what we have done, and this is the reason. See, the common person, that what is a student taught in the school? What is a student taught in the? We are not taught in the school what our indigenous thinkers thought. We are not taught what Shankara thought. We are not taught what a Manu says or what any of the Indic acharyas says. But instead, what we are taught in our schools, we are taught that constitution wherein we have equality, secular, social, and fraternity, and all those concepts. And we have these thinkers. We have a we have a lot of material on Abraham Lincoln, on Western thinkers, and all those things. See, there is nothing per se wrong in reading about them, but the problem is our frameworks are completely missing, and this is the reason that we are importing everything. See, you ask any girl, any woman who is in a especially urban educated person about Shabarimala, they will simply say that no, every woman should be allowed to go. It is our right. It is our we are a Janmasiddha right. In Kannada we say Janmasiddha, we have a birthright over entering temples and equality. So the fact is, these students, these youngsters, these men and women, they have not even spent half an hour to actually sit down and think deep about the issues. And even those who say, okay, what is happening? Let me become aware myself. Sits and does a Google search. All the news reports he sees, it put forward the same narrative, the same discourse, right? And with this same discourse, they say, okay, this is where everywhere is. I'm just compiling and digesting this news. So they're digesting the one particular kind of narrative. Where is the voice? Where is our voice, the Indic voice? Those few of us who are working to um, kind of provide voice to Hindu philosophy, Hindu frameworks and concepts. We are nowhere present in the mainstream media. We are nowhere present in the mainstream academia. And even when present, our voice is a very minority voice, and that too suppressed voice. So this is the reason. And as I'll just give a very simple example. My lecture on menstruation, I have done multiple videos on YouTube. It has received at best, if you compile everything and the total out, some 30,000 views. But you can just open so many videos, so many, related to menstruation, saying that these are all these practices are superstitious, all the outdated, regressive. They have millions of hits, tens and hundreds of millions of hits. So this is the kind of narrative difference, the difference in magnitude. Our reach is very, very less. So this is the I don't see any other reason for why a 10th standard girl or a 12th standard boy has to have this very negative opinion about the traditional Shabarimala practice, because the only thing he is able to read about Shabarimala practice is a negative thing. It's about the same narrative that it is against women, it is discrimination and this and that. So we have been drilled into our heads all these concepts. That I think that is the reason.
So, I am very, very sorely tempted to pick up on what you talked about the education system, but I think we could talk for an entire day, come up with more questions and not a single answer. And I'll also not talk about the fact that it's now been 6 years and we are still having this discussion, which I think tells us a lot about the priorities of us as a nation. But to be that as it may, I'm not going to go down that road. I want to take a couple of questions that have come in from the Q&A, and then we can perhaps talk a little bit about your road to publishing this book. And I also want to get in a couple of minutes about your next book that is coming up. So we have, okay, so I'll read out the first question. This question says, person asks, would like to know about menstrual hut practices and other practices which are there in Hindu culture which discriminate women from others and make them feel inferior. How would you describe about these kind of practices? And I think I remember reading someplace, so that's the end of the question. So, but I remember reading someplace, Nitin, that there is this red hut, red tent movement that has sprung up in the West. And from the little bit that I could find out, it talks about seclusion, exclusion of women in that state, and it seems that. So I mean, I'll stop here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I tackle this question in my book as well. It is so easy to make us believe that something is bad or patriarchal and how it is problematic, how it is degrades women. It is so easy without giving much a thought. Consider this. What basically happens in this traditional practice of some followed in some villages wherein this menstrual hut concept is there. The women of the village who are menstruating go and live in that hut for those 3 days. They are not necessarily alone. Their food and other needs are taken care of, and these women take rest there, and to the whatever limited facilities are available, because it's a village. People have the limited means many times, but on the other side of the globe, We have, instead of a hut, we have a tent, and women are going away from their families and spending time in these tents during their menstruation with other women who are also menstruating. So the same could have happened in a village as well, wherein 2 or 3 people who are menstruating will be together. So the point is, in the West, this notion that, I don't want to be with a family, I want to be with, separate, I want a me time, so to say, is is considered as a hallmark of freedom of women, women's freedom from patriarchy. But in India, the same phenomenon, because it is done by brown people, because it is done in villages, so it is the product of patriarchy, not a freedom from patriarchy. The same phenomenon on the ground, but it is the narrative spun around it is completely different. Two distinct narratives. But but consider the only the Indian practice, Hindu practice. It is possible. I perfectly agree that in many cases, the facilities provided for women in those huts may not be good, and certainly there will be scope of improvement, and there is nothing wrong in it. I mean, of course, one can have a hut with all the kind of luxuries. I have heard about women who used to in previous times, even 20, 30 years back, when they were young and they were having their periods, they did not go to huts, yes, but they were segregated within their own house, like perhaps a separate room or within their own rooms, and they used to take all these books and comics and such stuff, or some other things with themselves, and spend their time reading this. They were not oppressed. This was not degradation. It was kind of a holiday for them from otherwise hectic daily life. And nowhere in the Shastras they mention that women have to go and live in a hut. Let's this be clear, okay? What the Shastras simply say is that women has to avoid doing cooking, avoid physical, avoid contact with other members of the family, and she has to take rest, and she has to stay happy. There should be no physical exertion, no mental exertion, because all this will affect her health. As far as Ayurveda concerned, the health is the main issue. Dharma Shastras give other reasons, additional reasons for this. But whatever reason you are doing this, it benefits women. It's a rest period for them. They can sit in their place, in their rooms, it may be, and they can just enjoy their time. And that can be equally possible in a menstrual hut. If something is being implemented in a wrong way, that does not mean the an evolved practice itself is degrading to women. It is problem. It is not. It is not making women inferior, right? So these notions of inferiority, degradation, these are moral judgments we are imposing upon a practice which is otherwise has no moral connotation. It is in our minds that we see this as a moral inferiority, right?
Correct. So perfect. I think one question I think kind of asks and answers this question, that the other person asked and you answered, and I'll read that out. This is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, "Sir, on one hand, Indic practices are condemned, but on the other hand, there is so much emphasis and resurgence of the concept of the sacred divine feminine in the West, which celebrates red tent movement. Is this a complete U-turn?" So I think you kind of answered that by saying that just because something, if it comes from the West, it is considered modern, progressive, and correct, and anything that is traditional, indigenous, is considered regressive and discriminatory. So I think yeah, the other question is that
I would like to add a
sure,
point
go
to
ahead.
that question. Yeah. See, now the West is discovering a positive aspect of menstruation and femininity and all. That is fine. But if we consider any culture across the world, any standing surviving religion and culture, there is no culture, no religion as Hinduism which celebrates menstruation. We celebrate menstruation so much. And if in the urban spaces you are not seeing such celebration today, it is the problem with the urbanity, urbanization. It is a result of urbanization, not otherwise. In my book, there is a big chapter on menstruation in Hinduism and sacred celebrations, right? Wherein I have mentioned many such evidences. For example, when the girl has her menarche, has her first bleeding, today now it is mostly done in the south, especially in Tamil Nadu, wherein there is a huge celebration. All the relatives, all the neighboring people are invited, and a huge ceremony is done. It is as good, as big as a half a marriage. And Karnataka also, we have a very minor version of it. I have seen my sisters having this ceremony, very small ceremony, wherein the neighboring people are invited and they give all these gifts to the girl, and she's made to sit at the center of the place on a pedestal. These practices, this was at one point of time was practiced across India in various states, various tribal communities. I have made all these details in the book, and this practice, this is a kind of a samskara, Ritukala samskara, and this imparts a very positive, very sacred notion of menstruation to the young girls. And similar practices were also in Greeks. Greeks had took their young girls when they started bathing to the temple of Artemis, which was located outside on the outskirts of the city, and they performed a ritualistic dance called a bear dance. It was a ritualistic dance. It was to help women to transition from being a young child to a grown-up woman. So nobody can say that Hinduism does not celebrate menstruation. We alone have the festivals like Ambubachi in Kamakya, festivals like Rajaparba in Odisha, festivals like Kedasa among the Tulu community in Karnataka, or the temples like in Kamakya Mata is considered to undergo menstruation yearly. In Kerala, we have Parvati temple wherein every 3 to 4 months there are blood-like stains on the sari that the Murti of the Devi wears. And then there is 3 days rest is given to her. And then on the fourth day, there is a huge utsavam wherein lakhs of people from all surrounding villages come and celebrate and take her on a procession. So this we celebrate menstruation. We celebrate it hugely, and we are not afraid. We are not ashamed. The rural India which celebrates menstruation is not ashamed. The rural women may be shy, but being shy is not same as being ashamed.
Correct.
The shame is a concept which is modern in origin. In fact, I know I'm digressing little, but I want to make this point. Consider the modern sanitary products like Stay Free and Whisper. What is Whisper? Whispering means shushing, so keeping something quiet, say, telling in a very low voice. What does it convey to a young woman? It conveys that menstruation is something that is not to be talked about, something to be ashamed about, not to be discussed. What is Stay Free? In US, they have the brand of freedom. What is freedom? What is Stay Free? They want to convey that you wear a pad, you become free of menstruation such that you can win medals in swimming. You know, in the name of feminism, these products, what they are conveying is a masculinization of women. That they want women to go away from become free from their femininity, because menstruation is a part of their femininity, right? Part of their woman.
Fascinating. I think that's yet another aspect that we have, that I think we could spend a lot of time talking about, the concept of how you first demonize and instill a sense of shame in native pagan indigenous cultures. You make people repudiate their own customs and traditions, and then under a repackaged form, you import them and suddenly they become acceptable and modern. But leaving that aside, there are a couple of other questions also. So one is that, can we get a recording of the session? So yes, once the recording is available, we will put it up on YouTube. and this will also be available on the Indic Book Club Facebook group. So it is www.facebook.com/groups/Indic Book Club. So you can join, and you can, it is being live streamed even now. And once it is completed, I think it will again become available. Another question. So, okay, so there are a lot of questions that have come in. So one is want to know about relationship between moon and menstruation in Sanatan Dharma. Do you have anything on this, Nitin?
I have a chapter on it. I suggest they can go through this in the book. Yeah, moon and menstruations. That is a theme which is common across the world. Most cultures, even most polytheistic cultures have some kind of relationship between this moon and menstruation, and the changing cycles of moons and how it affects our mind and menstruation. All this, it is there. Yeah.
So, okay, so there is another question, and I think you've covered this to a large extent, but I will still read it out. And if you have anything to add here, it says it's by Mohit, and it says, Nitin sir, when I went through the practice in Kamakhya temple where only menstruating females are not allowed to enter, I found it creating sense because the temple is closed 3 days a year when the goddess is known to be menstruating herself. This gives a message that menstruating women need rest. The logic is decent. But in the case of Sabrimala, a whole group is segregated by saying that your age is menstrual, hence you can't enter. I don't see a logic here justifying enough, because the women can be or cannot be menstruating at the time she's ought to visit the Sabrimala. Can you please explain over this doubt I have?
Okay, it's very simple. The Sabrimala restriction is not because women are menstruating. The restriction is very simple. It restricts women in their reproductive age, that is, women capable of bearing children between menarche and menopause. Why it is restriction is there? Because the deity is an Aishtika Brahmachari. A Brahmachari is one who has a lot of restrictions upon him, and he cannot come in touch or any kind of contact with fertile women, with women of a fertile age, because the young children are like children and the old age women are like mothers. So the mothers and the children, the girls, young girls, have access to Sabrimala temple, but the others, the rest of the group between menarche and menopause, they are of reproductive age, and they are of age wherein sexual intercourse is possible, wherein so this is why, because of the brahmacharya nature of the deity, the women are restricted. So it has nothing to do with the monthly cycle of menstruation per se.
There are, okay, so there are still some unanswered questions. What I suggest is, Nitin, that we can continue this conversation on Facebook. I will take these questions and post them on the Indic Book Club Facebook group, and you can answer them there. The reason is I want to talk about, let's talk about your upcoming book, because I think it's important to, or at least I'm curious to know what you're working on next. And can you tell us a little about what it is and when it is expected to come out, and what made you write it, and why should we read that book?
Okay, I just had a quick look at the questions. I just want to give one-line answers. The question on Indra, please refer to my book. I have a whole chapter on the question of Indra. And there is one question about Ritukala Samskara being kind of sexualized notion. I think that is a problematic thing. It is not about sexualized notion. It is a mere recognition of a biology, the biological change that is happening in the woman. And no kind of narrative building can actually change the biological fact that woman has changed from her girlhood to a stage wherein her biological process, the menstruation process, the childbearing process has started. It is in the interest of the women that they understand these processes in a positive way, in a sacred way, so that they can negotiate with it in a more positive manner rather than in a regressive way that is happening in modern times, when menstruation is considered as some kind of a burden, or some kind of you can't get rid of it, but you don't like it. So that is a very negative way. So the samskara gives a very positive meaning to this. Yeah. So with this, sorry, I know you wanted this, but I wanted to address that. So yes, my next book is it's a English commentary that I have been working since I think 2012, 2013. It is an English commentary on Ishavasya Upanishad. Ishavasya Upanishad is one of the shortest Upanishad. The shortest is Mandukya. This is the second shortest. It has only 18 mantras. But within this 18 mantras, uh, it consists of, it enunciates an entire gamut of Vedanta, an entire gamut of Hindu philosophy itself. So I have elaborated. I have written a English commentary, but in a traditional format of a bhashya, wherein I have commented on each of the word in a verse, as well as a summary of each of the verse and explanation of each of the word in a verse. And in the second part of the book, I have given a free flow explanation of the philosophy of the Ishavasya Upanishad, which gives a kind of a, those who do not like the commentary format can read this format, wherein it gives a lot of background material to make sense of the Upanishad and its message. So this is hopefully coming up in, I think, by Deepavali. It is being published by Subbu Publication from Hubli.
Perfect. Thank you. I think this is something to really look forward to, Nitin. So thank you for sharing this. So folks, I think we are now at the end, or actually a little beyond our hour that we had planned. So thank you, Nitin, for coming on and doing this Q&A session, this author Q&A for Indic Book Club. And thank you everyone for joining, who joined this webinar, as well as those who joined in from the Facebook Live stream that is taking place. We will put this up on YouTube once it's available, and this was the first author Q&A, and we hope to do this periodically every 2 weeks or more frequently if we can. And we will give in more information about this through our social media handles. You can follow us on Twitter at Indic Book Club and on Facebook as groups/Indic Book Club. So with that, thank you again, Nitin, and thank you all for joining.